Good afternoon, everybody. We are so excited to be here with you on this Wednesday for one of our final webinars, one out of three webinars today. Before we get started, I'm going to introduce myself, and then I'm going to introduce our community who's with us today, who will engage in the webinar with us today, present the webinar. My name is Maria Hernandez. I use pronouns she, her, hers. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of School Change and Community Engagement and the Co-Director of Innovations in Equity and Systemic Change at Metro Center. Then I'm going to pass it on to Reed.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good to be here. My name is Reed Swier, he, him, his. I'm the co-director of IESC with Dr. Hernandez, and I've been working at Metro Center going into my 6th year. Excited to start kind of engaging with you all and talking about what's next. We're also trying to make sure that chat is activated, so you all will be able to kind of engage with us as well as we move. And I get to pass it on to Dr. Malone.
Hello, everyone. My name is Hui-Ling Sunshine Malone. I am an assistant professor of education at UC Santa Barbara, and it is a pleasure to be here with you and Dr. Hernandez and Reed today.
So as we begin to kind of move through our webinar today, we want to make sure that we know who our community is here. So as soon as the chat gets moving, we'd like to hear, maybe you could enter your name and into the chat, your pronouns if you're comfortable doing that, and then sharing where you're coming from today. We want to start the building block from where we've been and where we're going. And part of this means that in our first webinar, we really began to kind of highlight what it means to engage authentically in CRSC work, but really from the standpoint of what's the personal work that we have to be able to do to be able to be culturally responsive. What are the processes, right? So the effort has always been around how do we make sure that we have the capacity to do this work in partnership in the spaces that we're in. And the work also always starts with self. That is, we offered some essential tools to be able to do that individual work that becomes critical to be a culture responsive educator practitioner. Alongside that, how do we also begin to build internal capacity? So the ways that the book is set up is really set up to really think about what's the work that I have to do on an individual level, but how do I translate it into capacity building within my space. The second webinar really began to highlight what are the necessary pieces that I need to engage to make sure that we address disproportionality. Disproportionality, we highlighted, is systemic, right? But what are the elements, the tools that we need to be able to do that? And in that process, right, we garnered, how do we begin to think about the data that we look like? Who do we need to engage in a process that allows us to begin to take actions to address disproportionality? We are absolutely excited to really think the importance around where we begin to situate leveraging our young people's voices in addressing disproportionality. Part of those elements really begin to have us think about, to that end, what are the necessary relationships that begin with self, right? As an adult, within our own social identity markers to authentically engage our young people in addressing disproportionality. But how do we make sure that we create the conditions to develop leadership? And that starts with us. So some of our objectives today that Reed will move us through include.
Right. So y'all can see on the slides, and I love that we have the chat moving. So thank you. We have our, our expert Pharaoh in the background, making sure this is possible. So shout outs to him. But yeah, so to Dr. Hernandez's point, where we're trying to go. So we really want to offer this space in this next hour to more deeply understand, based on the expertise that's in this room, that includes you all, the process of youth-driven equity work, right? What is it? What does it need to look like? What does it look like in best practices in the past in districts and schools? And how can we support each other in next steps? And for our standpoint, right, this whole chapter 5 is outlining what those processes look like. So we want to really show you some of those critical tools and processes to center youth in leadership and voice within schools and districts. And then again, lastly, it's important for us to try to develop communities where we can ask questions. And we know webinars are hard in that often it feels like we're talking at you and you all are just taking it in for an hour. We would really appreciate it if there are questions to add to the chat. We'll tell you all at the end that we're setting up some kind of technical assistance, kind of drop-in time if there's other questions to further develop this community. But it's been important for us to kind of, particularly in this week, what does it mean to lean into who's in this room, who's here, who chose to be here, who's giving it themselves. One of our colleagues has the gift of being present. So thank you all for being here. We look forward to kind of continuing to dive into these objectives and to get to know a little bit about you all through the chat as we move. So our process, I wanna frame a little bit about both where the second book and our first book with the Dismantling Disproportionality title, what that's built into, what that looks like based on a couple decades of research and practice in districts in New York State and across the country, and a theory of change that we've developed within our team at Metro Center that's highlighted here. So from this graphic, all of the pieces that will engage both on the adult end and the youth end recognize what does it mean to create culturally responsive, sustaining environments that are capacity driven, right? That don't come in with a consultant and then leave, but stay within district, use the expertise and experience of young folks, particularly family caregivers and staff. And our theory of change moves from awareness to understanding to practices to sustained behaviors. So what you'll see, and we recognize that white text is not always ADA compliant. So I'll read a few pieces, right? So the awareness piece, our theory of change with this work is how do we deeply step into critical self-reflection as a primary step in an ongoing journey, right? What does that look like to dive into race-conscious conversations, engaging openly the impact of race and racism, uncovering bias, both conscious and unconscious, more deeply understanding the impact of white supremacy, privilege, and systems of racism. Our young people, which we'll talk y'all through, really supported where this theory of change lives and continues to push adults in districts. And that awareness moves into deeper understanding. And our goal always with capacity-driven approaches is, what do the practices look like? What does this look like actively every day in schools? And how can we turn that into an actual sustained behavior, right? So often in our schools, we have maybe one classroom in third grade that's doing culture responsive practices, maybe one department that's really leaning in. What does it look like, whether we're thinking about youth-driven approaches or cultural responsiveness and writ large, to fully move towards systemic sustained behaviors? So that's our theory of change. That's where we jump in. We're excited about that. I'll just add one quick thing before we keep moving. The first book we wrote with our colleague David Lopez. We're very excited and fortunate to have Dr. Malone step in on this second book with her expertise around youth leadership, her research and practice, which from folks that are probably here recognize it's very difficult to find individuals that embody the balance and the center point of theory and praxis. I've learned a ton from Dr. Malone in this process, and we're really excited to kind of step in with that expertise and following the voices of our young people. So we'll keep moving. Please ask questions as we go. Please comment, and we'll keep moving throughout this hour with these next steps.
So to be able to kind of situate where we've been and where we're going, our excitement came when Dr. Malone wanted to lead, do some youth leadership work around disproportionality. So the first component is that many of us have become very familiar with the ways that I call adults have defined disproportionality for us that have evolved from the Department of Education, which we couch under an overrepresentation of a specific group, whether it's been special education or disciplinary outcomes in relation to their overall student population, or it's oftentimes also an underrepresentation. That is adult-based language, and I highlight that mainly because part of the work that we realized when we were a center is that what we were missing in part of our work was oftentimes we would always engage adults in a lot of the work that we did, actually all the work we did, and that we knew the missing element for our work was our young people, developing youth leadership, developing our young people who have amazing ideas, brilliant ideas, and oftentimes are sidelined and not listened to. And so to that end, our youth developed a more profound and named what disproportionality was for them. So the work around the Youth Center for Disproportionality, I would say, became critical for us because for 15 years, we centered adults, and starting actually for 13 years, we centered adults. And then with Dr. Malone's expertise, we were absolutely excited that now we can really center our youth, but also develop youth leadership. And so our youth brilliantly actually began to really unpack what disproportionality is for them based on experiences, what it meant for them. And they came up with that definition of disproportionality as the outcome of institutionalized racism and bias that result in discriminatory beliefs, practices, policies, which negatively affect historically marginalized groups in contrast to privileged groups. So this is when the foundation of the work really began alongside Dr. Malone, who really guided, but also created our Youth Center for Disproportionality.
Now, I was just writing in the chat, but I'll just say it out loud. Y'all can probably notice already the differences that we're seeing in terms of adult-led definitions that are still active definitions with federal government, and what our young folks are saying needs to be our focus as we think about disproportionality and inequities that continue in our school system.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hernandez and Reed, for the very kind words. It's been an honor to work with you all and know you for the last several years. Wow. And I'm like thinking like, oh, I'm getting sad. Like we need to work on the next book so that you cannot leave me. Um, but yes, let's talk about the Youth Center for Disproportionality. How did we engage youth in this work? So chapter 5 talks about this process, and it's in the context of a school district that we're calling Light Point. It's a pseudonym. Most of you I'm sure are very familiar with this district, the largest district in the northeastern city. And we gathered young people across the city, across the district, 15 different high schools actually, to come together. And now this district was it's one of the more racially diverse districts in the country. However, it is extremely segregated. So when we brought the youth together, it was a very unique yet powerful experience for them to learn with each other and work with one another. So we came together and we ended up doing a participatory action research project, which we'll talk about, and to really examine their own educational experience and and they really played a role in driving what they wanted to see for themselves and their peers. So this is to first do this work, you have to have a solid youth adult partnership. And so scholars have talked about what it means for youth and adults to work together, because adultism is a thing. And a lot of the times, young people get tokenized and manipulated, or are kind of like window dressing for this type of work. And so if you look at the ladder that Roger Hart put together, it goes all the way from young people are manipulated to young people are assigned and informed, all the way to young people lead, and then young people and adults sharing decisions together. We added another rung here, where youth are really driving the decision making and adults are supporting them. But it can't just be any adult that's going to run a group like this or work with the young people. I'll have Reed talk a little bit more about what that adult, what role that adult should play and who that adult should be or could be.
And we wanna really kind of balance this. What did we all learn through this process, this multi-year process and project? And what do we continue to see in our districts, in our schools, right? With our educators, with our district leaders and our school leaders. So in our last webinar, we walked through the root cause process. What does it look like to have adults in a district come together and sift through data, disproportionality data, and really try to identify root causes for disproportionality and systemic inequities. That being said, I was in the district a couple weeks ago. We do 6 full-day sessions. We were in session 6, which was all about really naming the root causes, really naming our focus areas that we're going to start strategic planning and moving from there, right, with this heterogeneous group of educators and family and caregivers from across the community and district. And I moved into a kind of breakout room, and one of the groups, I asked them to look through all our data that we had moved through throughout the last 6 months, right? Which was discipline data, academic data, focus group data, intervention data, and like looking through academic and behavioral interventions. And one group was spending their entire conversation on like, oh, we need more clubs for young people. We need to make sure we lean into youth after school programs, or we need to make sure our student government has support or are leading. All of those things, yes, we need those spaces for young folks, but what we had just uncovered for 36 hours of sessions were all the gaps and inequities that adults have reinforced over the years, right? And what did we had found out from surveys across the district is that there was deep embedded bias on the part of educators that have reinforced over and over these gaps and these systemic inequities. So our balance continues to be, so my push to this group transparently was, yes, and what are we doing to mitigate what's happening with adults? Disproportionality is an adult problem. It's not a student problem, right? So our continued balance is, how do we create these spaces that Dr. Malone is going to talk to us about? How do we get to rung 9 with adults doing our work, right? Like, we can't get there if we're not simultaneously offering training and professional development for our educators. So we'll engage that, and we want to kind of problematize this notion of, do we just say, oh, tap young people, which happens all the time, to tell us what to do and then not give any decision-making, but say we had this youth-driven space? Or do we actually systemically and over time develop a plan to build adults and support young folks with the adults that are also deeply embedded in that work? So just want to bring that in, and please, as you think about your own districts, what does that look like? What does this relationship look like as you look at these ladders? You look at what YCFD really took and built on, and how can we really push the weight of the work, which is on adults, right, in our spaces.
Thank you, Reed. So we established and considered ourselves a contact zone, which is a intentionally intergenerational and politicized space. So it's different than saying this is a safe space or even a brave space where you're engaging with people from a group with different power differentials. When you have a contact zone, these sort of invisible factors or are visible and necessary to bring the group closer together. We don't hide behind our identities and different privileges, whether that's a racial difference, economic, language, ability, gender, etc., sexuality. So we got this term from Dr. Maria Torre, who is a scholar at the Grad Center and CUNY at the University of New York. And she notes that by framing our PAR collective as a contact zone, we create a politically and intellectually charged space where very different positioned youth and adults are able to experience and analyze power inequities together. And then furthermore, uh, from their group, and this is Maria Torre's words, privileged youth who otherwise might opt out of such work as it potentially challenges a system which benefits them, ally with historically marginalized youth who also might not have joined the research collective, as they learn well that change is slow and promises are rarely kept. As a collective, we have used our differences rather than ignoring them to further thinking, research, writing, and speaking on educational equity and change. So it was very important that our identities and who we are is not detached from like a historical and political environment and climate. So yeah, that helped us become a stronger and closer group and a more trustworthy group to not hide behind who we are and what we're bringing into the space. And so to do that, yeah, we also had to, do community building and all that good stuff. But again, that political part was not was present. So in order to create these spaces, before jumping into this project, because we will get into what the actual YPAR project was about, we had to do some work around political education. And just as the adults go through this process, all right, with Dr. Hernandez and Reed, we had to define certain terms. And these are tools that are in the book. And so you'll see some of the things that we did and that you can also apply to your context. But we define terms like what's equality, what's equity, what's access, how do we define race? And so we did a lot of that work before diving into the actual project itself. And then you can hit the next slide. So more than that, we also went into topics from like a global to local context around schooling. And so we couldn't just talk about their schooling experience without talking about how they're connected to other schools in the district and how these districts are connected to other schools across their state and nation. So we took a deep dive into housing discrimination, segregation, what redlining is, because that's not separate from how these students are seeing themselves segregated in their schools. We looked at suspension and discipline disparities across the city and across the nation. And there were lots of local things that were happening within the district at the time, especially around like high schools, high achieving high schools and testing, right? Gatekeeping there and different roles that folks were playing, some of them being Chinese Americans or first generation Chinese Americans and what the model minority myth and putting all of that together to connect a politicized context that's happening to frame what's going on in their schools so that they know that this is not isolated. Sorry, I didn't know they all clicked. Okay, so once we were able to really get through that several sessions around that, then once there's an understanding, because you don't want to go in without that, I don't know, going in with color evasiveness or things like that. We conducted the YPAR project and we did it twice. So this was over a scope of a couple years. And this last project, that one that I'm talking about here, was was larger and included adults. So 9 schools participated. We had more than that, but we felt like the data was sufficient from the 9 schools. There were 424 student surveys that we gave out and included adults as well, with a total of about almost 500 surveys that we went through together as a group. And the surveys represented geographically, racially, and social economically diverse experiences from across this entire district. So the youth who participated really put in work, distributing this survey, allying with adults at their school to allow them to distribute it. And we spent quite a bit of time going through them to analyze them. So just to give you an idea of what a survey can look like, and you may want to use a different tactic if you're just doing this in your school context. Maybe you want to hold focus groups or do it a different kind of way, but because of how large our district was that we were conducting this work in, we just thought it would be best to do a survey that we distributed. So the real question here was, what did it feel like to be you in school? And we asked them to do 2 things, to answer, one, what it feels like to be them in school. And they have to draw a picture of what that looks like. And then 2, draw another picture of what your ideal or perfect school experience looks like. So we weren't sure what was going to happen, but we really wanted to kind of humanize their experiences and have them go ahead and visually represent what that means. And then they actually wrote descriptions of their pictures as well. And as you can see from the survey, we didn't have them check boxes. We did that intentionally for them to put their own age, their own gender, their own race and ethnicity, so that they self-define that rather than it being checks boxes. Because with this new administration, we don't know what they'll even be able to click anymore. And next slide. This is the same survey, but it is for the educators, and we asked them to do the exact same thing that we asked the youth to do, what it feels like to be them in school, draw a picture, and what their ideal school experience looks like, drawing a picture, and then on the other side, writing a description of what their drawings represent. And so this is a little bit of what it looked like. We're going to show you, in a second. So just to give you an idea of the schools that were represented here, out of the 9, there were 3 what we considered high achieving, and that was just based on the data of the percentage of college readiness, just measured on the data we pulled from the district. Most of those schools, or all those schools, were predominantly white and Asian, and they didn't have any more than 5% Black students at those schools. There was a middle achieving school that was about 60 to 79% college readiness and was about 80% white. There were 3 low middle achieving, which was about 40 to 59% college readiness. And those were looking less white, like 50% South Asian, the rest Black, Latinx. And then there were 2 low achieving schools that were below 30% college readiness and were predominantly Black and Latinx. And there were no more than 3% of white students in those schools. So you can see how segregated these schools really were. And one other thing to note is that these schools also represented the students in the group. So you can see how they came from such very different contexts, and how being able to do this together was so important for them to bring to the fore some of the things they're experiencing and kind of like put the pieces of the puzzle together by doing this project with each other and having these conversations. And it's easy to cherry pick students to do this type of work who are already high achieving, who are in student government, or the well-liked ones, but we want to make sure that in this group, when we do this work, that it is represented and how students are racially, academically, how involved they are, their discipline status, so on and so forth.
And just to name that, yeah, even more specific. So jumping into the group and learning from the young folks, there was a white male high schooler that was a part of the school that's for decades has been the hardest to get into in the district, right? And then there were Black female student that was suspended multiple times from a community school that continually shows up as a school that's in high need, quote unquote, right? So, and all the intersections in between. So that level of dialogue and using the data to have dialogue with across those differences was so critical as a team moved, and from the adult perspective coming in as a learning piece.
Thank you so much for adding that, Reed. And just to give you a snapshot of what these schools looked like when we looked at principal suspension, the risk index for that, we got to look together to see what what that visually looked like. So as you can see, just every school across the line, you have a disproportionality around Black students, and often Latinx students being suspended more often than their counterparts. And I think it was really powerful for them to be able to see the data and engage in that, and then humanize that, and then be able to personify what that actually meant and looked like and felt like for them. Oftentimes when we do this work, we'll just pull data like this and stop there and say like, well, we know our Black students are being suspended more, but we don't really stop and think and ask, what does that mean for our youth who are experiencing this day in and day out? And I think what was important about this project is that it pulled out those experiences. So we had the quantitative data, and we also had the qualitative side, and those were able to speak. They're able to speak to this school equity work in multiple ways. So what did youth, how did they respond? And these are some examples that we pulled. So this is from a self-identified 15-year-old freshman, Black Puerto Rican female, and she just drew herself. She said, in this school, I know that might be hard to read. It's as if I'm isolated because of what I look like and who I identify as. They bring up annoying stereotypes that are nowhere near true. It's also like some people pity me and even try to show sympathy for no reason. It's also like they don't want me to be who I really am. Instead, they try to make up some character they want me to pretend I am. It's a toxic environment. And in this school, there aren't many other Black students. And so she draws herself upset. And the majority is saying things like, can I say the word? Do you actually know your dad? Blah. And then what she wants it to look like. And if you can click read. She says, the ideal school for me is a place where I'll be accepted. I'm not such a social person, but still I'll feel comfortable talking to and being around others. No one says dumb, funny stereotypes. Everyone is good vibes, or just doesn't want to make anyone uncomfortable, or like they don't belong. It's a fun but smart environment. And so she draws herself happy, and it says equality, and it says like, your sweater is cool. And can't really read the rest, but yeah. So where are my glasses? But yeah, she has much more positive things to say there. And then other things that came out around, because we surveyed literally every demographic we could try to reach. So then you have a white male, or he identifies as white Latin male, 17-year-old senior. And we found that white students often felt normal in school. So this was one that represented that finding. He's like, I just feel like I'm an average person, just another student in a school with thousands of other students. That's what he feels like in school. And if his ideal was just keep doing what I'm doing now. And so we saw the differences around what it meant to be a Black female student versus what it meant to be a white student in school. And this was, I think, a middle achieving school. Most of his peers were white. Another example from a 17-year-old Black female, what it feels like to be in school is that it makes me feel mad because the deans always yell at me. And this was a common one. Lots of students wrote down, especially Black students or Latinx students, that teachers just yell at them, and without actually feeling like they needed to be yelled at. Like before asking any questions, they were being yelled at. So the dean is shouting, go to class now. And the student says, okay, stop yelling. And then what the ideal experience looked like was would be to let me do me and don't yell at me all the time. Pretty simple. But the dean now says, please go to class. And the student goes, okay. Next one. So this is in one of the higher achieving schools. This is a 15-year-old sophomore Asian student. And she says, in this school, I feel like I can be accepted for who I am. I won't get bullied for anything, but creating close connections with people for a long period of time is really hard. I'm also very tired in this school. There's a lot of pressure for AP. And so this school, a lot of students felt like they just had a lot of academic pressure and their mental health was not great because of it. And ideally, the student wanted teachers would understand how long the homework takes for some of us to do and follow policy. I also wish for better art classes. I don't want to learn history. I'd rather be able to unleash and use my creative side. So this is what the student was looking for in her experience. And then this is another one. I think this might be our last student one, but a 16-year-old junior Caribbean male drew some bars behind bars, saying, I feel imprisoned in school. I wish I didn't have to stand in line to be searched to get into school and then be held to a strict code as to what I have to do during the day. I wish the teachers would help us in our individual learning styles than having to be forced to work in ways that don't work for me. And ideally, now you actually can see his happy face, a fluid environment that promotes an environment that makes kids excited to be in and participate. And this was not the only student that drew themselves in a jail as representing their school experience. And so you saw the wide range of experiences throughout all these surveys, and it told a very, powerful story and narrative that helps us understand the data as well, the quantitative data. So like I said, we also distributed the surveys to teachers. And so some of the things that they said was that this drawing shows what I would like would happen in my school. It shows a group of students, parents, administrators, and teachers sitting at a round table making executive decisions and being equally heard. And so this first picture says that she's facing the giants, which is admin, right? Leadership. And there's a round table in the next one where everyone is coming together, parents, students, teachers, so on and so forth. This is a white male teacher. His first drawing says that right now, students from many different cultures, races, genders, backgrounds are not engaging with the class, maybe because the curriculum centers around books written by predominantly old, dead, white male authors. And next, he wrote drawing number 2 shows students from all different walks of life engaging with and discussing the content because it's more diverse. And he writes on the board, men, women, Black, white authors, and they're engaging. So he is pointing to education that is clearly not culturally responsive or sustaining. You can go to the next one. And this is an African-American male teacher. He feels like a lonely unicorn. He's Black, he teaches math and chemistry, is one of the 2 Black male teachers in the school of about 500 students, and 80% are male boys of color. So feeling like a ostracized educator in the building due to his Blackness, which is the research shows around how teachers of color are pushed out of the profession. Rita Coley actually talks about that in her work. He wanted to teach the same subjects while leading and mentoring new and younger teachers. I would be one of a diverse faculty that represents all racial groups, especially our men of color. I would also be a school with great athletics and academics. So that was his ideal vision. And next, this might be the last one. We've got this drawing here. He emphasized that their implementation makes them feel like, so the implementation of these national standards, right, and all these tests makes them feel like titanic forces governing our lives and the kinds of classroom I and my students want to have. And so he feels like he is controlled by standards that don't really help students learn and really engage in the classroom. And so he would prefer In his picture that him and his students are outdoors on a trip, they're seeing something rare and impactful, and that students are visually stimulated, they're taking pictures, they're writing about their experiences, and instead of just reading about them, they are actually experiencing them. So here are the 8 themes that came up through our process. And you may find similar themes when you go through yours, or maybe different depending on the context. But it does speak to the research around educational disproportionality. So students in high achieving schools felt an overwhelming pressure to succeed. White students felt they were treated fairly. Students who were at a school with concentrated white population viewed disproportionality as individual failures of people of color. That was one that I didn't represent, but definitely one that came up. Black, Latinx, and Muslim students felt isolated at predominantly white and Asian schools. Students in predominantly Black and Latinx schools did not have a favorable schooling experience, so they're not having a great experience anywhere. Students at elite schools felt the schooling system worked mostly fine, and the absence of teachers of color impacted the schooling experience for students and staff, and students wanted what they called diversity. That's something we could explore more around what that means, because once you get to diversity, that sort of change and you got people running away, but we'll get into that another time. But this is what we found in this project that we did together. Can you go to the next slide? So I want to share this student reflection. There were several students that felt like they really appreciated this experience, and many have gone on to do amazing things. I think this student actually did a Fulbright or something, or is on a Fulbright right now. But she wrote, YCFD was a space where we learned to name and identify the root causes and underlying systems that created the educational experiences we were having. It allowed for analyzing and dissecting the historical, systemic, local, and national conversations around the education system, specifically in disproportionality and segregation in race, socioeconomic status, and disability. These conversations then allowed for honesty and vulnerability in our own personal experiences. Our findings and conclusions led to make policy recommendations and proposals, as well as joining conversations with education leaders. Overall, the process of learning about the foundational context for personal experiences, researching the manifestations of systemic issues, and then presenting them in policy proposals or in key conversations helped us to begin to humanize data rather than allow it to be one-dimensional. This work was important because it allowed us to turnkey our findings and understandings back to our respective communities and also to broader conversations in the educational policy sphere. So I think this really captures what we aim to do and what we accomplished in many ways. I'm sure it was not perfect. This work is very messy and can be organic, and it may look different, as I said, in many different contexts. But we did, I think what we're calling here the best practices, and that is establishing that contact zone, not hiding behind our privileges and vulnerabilities. Putting the educational, putting this conversation in a larger context that's not detached from a historical and a socio-political perspective. So all of those things were key, and having adults who have done the personal work as well, and then bringing this to as a call to action, not stopping here, but really bringing this into the schools to create a different and better experience, and hopefully creating long-lasting relationships between school adults and the young people and their students. And we hope that is really going to help drive the pathway for change, really centering their voices and experiences. So I think I'm going to stop talking, but we do leave you with some critical questions here, which I won't read out loud, but they're here for you, and I'll turn it back to my amazing colleagues, Dr. Hernandez and future Dr. Reed.
So as we've engaged in this process, we want you to really start thinking what part of these tools can you utilize, right? I think what Dr. Malone highlighted for us was powerful. How do we engage our young people through YPAR? And what are the elements of the tools that you can really begin to kind of think about in terms of how you're first fundamentally engaging our young people? Two, how are you creating the conditions for an actual contact zone, right? What's that personal work that needs to be done? Because oftentimes we're so excited about engaging our young people. We want their voices to be central to schooling. And at the same time, when we have these moments when it doesn't work, right? We return to, have I reimagined what our young people have the capacity to do? Have I reimagined the ways that I perceive young people is impacting our movement and developing our young people? So that's why that central work to what Dr. Malone highlighted and Reed first really highlighted for us, right? Doing the personal work to authentically be able to engage our young people across different social identity markers and move them through authentic uh, relationship building. The other set of tools, right, that I think we saw Dr. Malone move us through is centralizing political education, right? Our children know what's happening, but sometimes the adults don't feel comfortable in engaging our children in what's actually happening. How do we localize it at a national level to begin to localize it more at a more local context for us? And how do we begin to then connect it to critical data, right? Ongoing data that what it offers, right? Are young people able to tell us the experiences and the stories behind the data, whether it is discipline data that we're looking at, whether it is enrollment in AP and honors that we can be looking at, right? But they're going to be telling us the background story, the experiences connected to and the beauty of this work, right, is that our young people in chart paper were able to tell us a deep story around what are these discipline outcomes connected to, right? How are they experiencing them within their respective school? Alongside that, the tools around also having surveys, right? Surveys that really are simple in nature, to Dr. Malone's post, focus groups or listening sessions, right? With both our young people, but also our educators in spaces, right? To utilize data then to really generate what's next for us, right? What is next for us, and the continuation of making sure that our young people are involved in all aspects, right? Because when we begin to fully have dismantled disproportionality, becomes this moment where we've centralized our young people in partnership in our educational process. We've centralized their voice. We're really centralizing their voice in terms of how we want them to experience schooling. So to that end, right, as you're thinking about how do we do this work, right? What are our next steps, right? We would love to hear from you in the chat. What are pieces from what has been highlighted today that are making you think differently, right? What are pieces that have been highlighted today that you can take one thing away, right? So in the chat, put one thing that you learned today or that you can take away with you today. Please use the chat to let us know.
And is it okay if I respond to John's
Oh,
question?
absolutely.
Yeah, so John Anthony Tucker asked, how do you break the initial barriers that many youth show when asking about their experiences? I think that's a really good question. What worked for us, I mean, I think it's important to, one, have first, there are some superficial things that you want to do. And I say superficial, but like, just breaking the ice. What do you like to do? What's your favorite candy or something? There's always some kind of initial icebreaker that may be kind of silly to bring us together. But I think what really kind of pierces through to get to those deeper experiences is starting to pull out the larger political context that surrounds their experience, because that once they see what's happening in schools around disproportionality and discipline and academics, how you break down racial disparities, it's like the shame starts to like melt away, like fall back, and they feel affirmed in their experiences. I think that some students think that because they get in trouble, it's their fault. But we found that they were really excited to speak back to us around some of the things we were talking about. And it didn't really take that much work. I think that they once you give them the platform, they kind of run with it. And we never had an issue with them talking at length around their experiences, whether they came from more privileged schools or backgrounds, or more or other contexts. So I hope that answers your question. But yeah, I think bringing the personal and connecting that to like the larger context was helpful in breaking those barriers.
Can we go to the next slide as our community here continues to add pieces they may be taken away from the session today, but please also add questions you may have. We wish that we can see everybody. We wish that you can ask your questions directly. Just like we always say, the webinar is awesome, and at the same time, it limits us. But we want to say, if there are, as you're thinking about whether you've attended our Authentic CRSC webinar, or you've attended our root cause analysis webinar in our final webinar, is that on March the 12th from 6 to 7, we will be hosting a technical assistance drop-in session that to support anybody in our space today or in our prior spaces who actually want to start doing this work, right? We always call it the hand-holding work, right? Sometimes we don't know where to start. And so part of that session is really set up for us to engage directly with community who's attended this session or prior sessions to support in any area, questions you may have, or where's our entry point, so on and so forth. So on our end, what we will do is we will email individuals who come to the sessions, send an actual Zoom link to register, and come with your questions, come with your places around how you enter, where we can start the work, or any other pieces that you think would be helpful. And the point of the webinars have been really around what are the necessary tools and resources that are needed, right, to be able to dismantle disproportionality. And how do I do this on an individual level, but how do I build capacity within my respective space, right? So we welcome you on March the 12th, and would be excited to see you with any prospective questions that you may have. Can we go to the next slide? We always want to lift the individuals who've supported our ongoing work. And I always think about thinking about our families and students who do this work all the time, right? They push us all the time. And then for all our educators who do this work every single day, we're grateful. And then we've also had critical colleagues who just gave us feedback around the chapters in our book, but individuals who are teachers who are directly in districts, because we wanted to make sure it was relevant. And the foundation of a lot of our work has come from Dr. Pedro Noguera and Dr. Fergus. We want to leave space to see if you have any questions that you want to put into the space, or last thoughts that you may have before we depart today, or any add-ons that Dr. Malone or Reed have to offer into the space. And also, we also want to invite you to our Equity Now conference, centering welcoming, affirming, and healing space schools. Our keynote speaker on that day that we are so excited and honored to have is Dr. Gloria Lanson Billings. And we have an amazing program of districts and schools who actually have created welcome, affirming, and healing schools for children, families, community, and educators.
Just share appreciations as well. I see in terms of, so the book has all the resources that you saw, all the pieces that Dr. Malone shared are in the book. So go get a copy, get your admin to buy you a copy, and buy your department a copy. We had Teachers College Press embed a URL so it could be downloadable, right? So there's a PDF of all those templates to make that as easy as possible for folks to resource share. So please step in there. You can, we can share emails, but you can also find us through NYU Metro Center and that work. I think there's probably also a link through the webinar that where you all originally signed on. To Dr. Hernandez's point, we always want to be a resource hub, right? We know what it looks like to juggle all the duties that you move through in the day, and want to make sure that we can support folks as best as we possibly can.
I'll just lastly say thank you all for joining us and for the work that you do every day, because it is not easy, especially in this context. And I do want to respond very quickly to, I think, Luanda, who talk about time. I'm not gonna lie, it is time. It is an investment, but it was so worth every bit of it. But hopefully your district or your whatever your context in will take it seriously enough to pay that facilitator, to maybe even pay some of the youth, but to compensate for what they're doing, because they're putting in a lot of work to create change for the greater good. So I want to make sure I say that it's not just easy work, but it is important and great work to do. All right. Thank you all. And our emails are in the chat if you want to reach out.
All right.
All
I'm gonna
right.
I think I'm in charge of signing us off. So
Yeah.
thank you all. Appreciate
Thanks, y'all.
you, Dr.
Have a
Hernandez and
good
Dr.
one.
Malone. Shout out to everybody that came through, and those that we know and those that we're getting to know. Please, yeah, like we don't say it just to say it. Please reach out. Let's continue to build a community. All right, y'all. Be safe.